Hello and welcome to our first ever episode of podcast. I am Josh and today we will dive into a different perspective onto the state of process of freedom under President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. administration. Joining me today is Isabel, a communication student who will share her perspective on these complex issues. Our first argument is controlled media. Let's start with President Marcos' control over the media. He prefers pre-recorded speeches or a friendly interview over unscripted press conference. We have seen instances where critical media outlets were blocked, like during the incident with Rappers reporter Liam Buan. I'll go with Isabel first. So, what do you think of this approach? Is this a legitimate tactic for managing the media or narrative?
I think it's concerning. It is a dangerous path that allows the president to control the story before it's even told. While it's understandable to want to control the message, it limits the accountability of the leader. When he only talks to media that's sympathetic to him, like during his campaign, it shuts down any tough questioning. Without this scrutiny and transparency, all we get is a filtered, incomplete version of the truth.
I see your point, Isabel, but sometimes managing the narrative can prevent confusion and misinformation. In a highly polarized media environment, these controlled formats can help ensure that the message doesn't get distorted. However, it is crucial that the government doesn't suppress all critical voices, which would compromise transparency if the public only sees one side trust and the government erodes.
That's an interesting point, and I see the dilemma. It should be balanced. I see how it could be tempting for a leader to manage how their message is received. Sure, controlling the narrative can prevent misunderstandings, but at what cost? I see how it could be tempting for a leader to manage how their message is received, but we need to ensure that all sides of the story are heard, and that can't happen if media outlets are blocked or forced to toe the line.
Yeah, I actually agree with that. And let's not forget the strength of unscripted media. The public can see how a leader reacts under pressure. That's part of the transparency people need. Without it, we risk becoming a country where only narrative gets out.
Yeah, right. But I also see the weakness here. When press conferences turn hostile, it can cause unnecessary friction. Leaders might hesitate to engage if they feel constantly attacked.
Fair point. So, what's the way forward here? How can we balance control and press freedom, especially when it is necessary for the governance?
I think what we really need are clear guidelines. It's one thing to have control, but transparency and access to a variety of voices should still be a top priority. The press should definitely be able to challenge the government, but in a way that promotes conversation, not just confrontation.
That's right. We shouldn't be seeing media outlets being blocked or harassed. If critical media can do their job without fearing retaliation, that would really help foster a healthier public discussion. Maybe it's time for independent bodies to step in and actively monitor press freedom to make sure it is protected. Okay, so let's move on to our argument two, which is journalist killings and impunity. Moving on to a much more troubling issue, the killings of journalists under Marcos. We've seen how a slow response to case like the deaths of Perry Lapid and others. Isabel, do you think that this lack of action is a major concern?
It absolutely is. The government's slow response to these killings is very troubling. Percy Lapid's murder in October 2022 is one of the many cases that remain unresolved, with little progress in arresting suspects. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, the lack of swift justice sends the message that attacks on journalists may go unpunished. This undermines press freedom and emboldens those seeking to silence critical voices. When there's no swift action, it sends a chilling message to the media. If they can't protect journalists, how can we trust them to protect the truth? You know what? It's more than just a concern. It's a crisis for press freedom. Impunity sends a message that the government doesn't care about protecting journalists or holding perpetrators accountable.
But could there be other factors affecting this? The government might be dealing with a backlog or other issues, right?
I understand that, but the fact remains if the government doesn't act swiftly and decisively, it only fuels further violence.
Right. If the government truly cares about press freedom, it has to act swiftly in these cases. The longer the delay, the more of the public doubts its commitment to justice. So, what are the possible solutions here? How do we ensure the safety of journalists and hold perpetrators accountable?
I believe there should be a comprehensive overhaul of how cases involving journalists are handled, and perhaps international oversight could help ensure impartiality. External pressure might be necessary to make sure these cases don't get swept under the rug.
I totally agree with that. There are also needs to be have or to have more transparency in investigations. The public needs to see the government in a serious about protecting journalists. So moving on to our argument three, let's touch on the rise of hyper partisan vloggers. The Marcos administration has accredited this pro Marcos vloggers which has raised concerns about bias in the media. Isabel, what are your insights on this? Do you think this is a real problem?
It's a big problem because it undermines the credibility of media. Let's say, for example, in June 2022, media watchdogs like the NUJP raised concerns over the accreditation of pro Marcos vloggers who were given access to government events. These influencers often present a biased narrative, which distorts public perception. By giving them legitimacy, the government essentially validates one sided propaganda.
I actually see the concern, but I also think we can dismiss all vloggers. They have a huge reach, especially among younger influencers or audiences. The problem isn't the platform, they can be an important part of the media ecosystem. But the issue arises when they aren't held to the same standard as traditional media outlets.
That's a fair point, Josh. But when these vloggers are given official access and recognition without clear accountability, how do we ensure they aren't simply manipulating narratives to fit a specific agenda, right? They should be held to the journalistic standards like fact checking, balanced reporting, and transparency. Otherwise, they become just another tool for spreading disinformation.
It's actually a double-edged sword. On one hand, you want the media to be inclusive and diverse, but on the other hand, there's a real risk of lowering standards for the sake of engagement. That seems like a good compromise. So, how can we strike the balance between inclusivity and integrity? What's the solution?
There should be a clear framework for accrediting vloggers with a code of ethics to ensure they follow journalistic principles. Maybe a board that evaluates content for accuracy and fairness. I'd recommend implementing some of regulations similar to what traditional media faces so that vloggers know they can be held accountable for misleading or biased content.
Yeah, okay, so moving on to our last argument, let's discuss the broader impact on media freedom, the lack of engagement, which are critical to media and rise of bias content. It has a real consequence. The NUJP highlights the ongoing threats to journalists and press freedom remains fragile. So, Isabel, how do you think this affects the democracy of our country?
Honestly, it's really concerning because without a free press, the government gets to control the story and the public gets left in the dark. A democracy thrives on transparency, and when journalists can't do their job, everything starts to crumble. I agree. When the press is silenced, it's like the foundation of the democracy starts to crack. Journalists need to be able to ask tough questions and challenge the government without fear of retaliation. Without that, we risk losing the transparency and accountability that keep our system in check.
So yeah, that's exactly it. That's exactly it. If the media is controlled, it is a lot harder for the public to hold the government accountable. So, what do we need to make sure the media freedom stays strong?
Well, we need stronger legal protections for journalists and independent bodies monitoring press freedom. Public support for independent journalism is crucial to prevent further erosion.
Okay, so as we have discussed today, the situation with the press freedom under Marcos's administration is complex. There's a fine line between controlling the narrative and suppressing dissent, and unfortunately, the slow justice for journalist killings and the rise of hyper-partisan bloggers show how fragile the situation is. The need for transparency, accountability, and stronger protections for journalists has never been clearer. That concludes our podcast for today. Thank you, Isabel, for your thoughtful insights. As always, we hope for this episode to spark further conversation and action. Stay informed and join us on our next podcast.
Una yeah yeah, una yeah, una yeah yeah, una yeah yeah, una yeah, una yeah yeah, una.